Beneath the crowns, behind the portraits, hidden in footnotes and erased in whispers, there lies a secret history of the British royal family you were never meant to know. They ruled empires, wrote laws, and performed masculinity for the world stage. But some were born into roles that didn't fit, and some rewrote them in silence. This isn't just about scandal. It's about identity, myth, and what history dares not say aloud. These are the 25 British royals who may not have been the men history says they were. You've heard the official story. Now, meet the unofficial one. Before we dive in, if you're into hidden histories, forbidden footnotes, and the stories royal biographers hoped you'd skip, hit subscribe to join us on the darker side of the monarchy. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Are you up late like a court gossip, or catching this mystery over morning tea? Let's see who's listening in the shadows. 1. Edward II of England. There are kings who ruled, and there are kings who were ruled. Edward II of England, crowned in 1307, may have worn the crown, but his heart and his judgment belonged to someone else entirely, maybe to two someone else's. And from that awkward royal triangle grew a legacy so slippery, so emotionally tangled, that centuries later, even the most hard-nosed historians still can't decide whether he was a romantic fool, a political naïf, or something far more complicated. It always starts with Piers Gaveston, Edward's favorite, his confidant, his brother, according to the charters. But the kind of brother you give power, jewels, and kissing nicknames. Their relationship was the emotional engine of Edward's early reign. Gaveston was handsome, brash, and very clearly not from the right side of the aristocratic tracks, which of course made Edward like him more. The two were inseparable in a way that didn't sit well with the other barons. It wasn't just favoritism, it was flagrant. Piers was decked out in luxuries, elevated to high office, and most importantly, he acted like he owned the place, because in some emotional way, he kind of did. The barons were not amused. Parliament rolled its eyes. Even Edward's wife, Isabella of France, was reportedly pushed aside. Gaveston was exiled more than once. Edward brought him back every time. You know, like a rational king does when his lover is destroying the country's political cohesion. But Gaveston's story ended the way stories do when too many powerful men feel too insulted, with a swift execution and an unmarked grave. They said it was for the good of England. Edward said nothing, at least nothing that history preserved. But something in him shattered. Then came Hugh Despencer the Younger. Where Gaveston had been the reckless spark, Despencer was the slow-burn schemer. With Gaveston gone, Edward turned to Hugh with a desperation that was less affection and more addiction. This time the intimacy was quieter, but even more dangerous. Hugh wasn't content to be adored. He wanted land, titles, power, and Edward gave it all to him, piece by piece, tearing the kingdom further into factions. Chroniclers of the time weren't subtle. They called the king's affections unnatural. They noted the evil counsel of low-born favorites. They snuck in words like effeminate, indulgent, unmanly. Today, we might call this bias. Back then, it was just a convenient way to delegitimize a ruler. But the emotional truth seeps through the centuries. Edward had an overwhelming, destabilizing attachment to men who treated him like he mattered. And if his enemies wanted to call that treason, they didn't have to look far for proof. Eventually, Isabella, scorned queen, political chess player, and woman with an army, had enough. She aligned with her own lover, Roger Mortimer, and marched against Edward and Hugh. The end came, like something out of a badly staged tragedy. Edward was captured, Hugh was hanged, and Edward, that's where the story takes a turn. Or several, depending on which version you believe. The official version says Edward was imprisoned, deposed, and died soon after, possibly murdered. though the method is a favorite of grim rumor and best left unsaid. But another version whispers through the historical margins that he escaped, that a body double stood in for him, that he lived out his days quietly in obscurity, maybe even abroad, that the king who lost his throne and his lovers still somehow slipped the noose of history. Of course, none of that can be proven, but maybe that's fitting. Edward's entire life feels like a palimpsest, a royal script overwritten by politics, propaganda, and performance. Was he a queer monarch in a straight world? Was he a weak king manipulated by desire? Was he both? Or was he something else entirely? Someone born into the wrong century, playing by rules he didn't understand, clinging to love in a world that only respected power? And if Edward II was hiding in plain sight, lost behind a mask of royal dignity and court gossip, what about his great-great-grandson? The one who styled himself as a king of kings, but might have been living a secret of his own. You'll know him by the way he speaks, like he's performing for someone no one else can see. 2. James VI and I. James VI of Scotland, later James I of England, was the kind of monarch who made everyone around him slightly uncomfortable, though not for the usual reasons. He didn't behead anyone for sport. He didn't spend half his reign at war. He didn't even bother pretending to be graceful. Instead, he ruled with a mind like a labyrinth and a heart like a locked room that occasionally opened to let in one man at a time. If Edward II's story was about passion destroying power, James's story is about intimacy shaping it. His reign is remembered for the King James Bible, for early talk of uniting England and Scotland, and for the divine right monologues that could make a bishop sweat. But underneath that theology and policy was something profoundly human, a pattern of attachments that blurred the line between affection and influence. The first name whispered into that pattern was Esme Stuart, a French cousin who arrived at the Scottish court when James was a teenager. James was 15, already brilliant and lonely, already king, but not yet sovereign in spirit. Esme was 24, charming, handsome, polished, everything the rough Scottish nobility wasn't. Within weeks, the young king was infatuated. He called Esme my leman, a word meaning beloved. They spent their days together, exchanging jewels and glances in equal measure. The courtiers noticed, the nobles panicked, and the preachers thundered. Rumors spread that Esme had bewitched the king, or worse, that he had taught James a kind of intimacy that could not be preached from any pulpit. Political pamphlets called it an unspeakable sin. Esme was forced into exile. James wrote him letters, desperate, tender, unabashed. He signed them, yours only. When Esme died in France not long after, James wore mourning clothes longer than etiquette allowed. He would later tell his council that he loved Esme more than anyone else on earth. But time, as it does, smoothed over scandal, or at least replaced it with new names. Next came Robert Carr, a Scottish page turned royal favorite, whose beauty reportedly made the king forget his own speeches. Carr's rise was meteoric, but it wasn't built on competence. He was the kind of man who smiled and let other people write his letters. Yet James couldn't get enough of him. He gave Carr titles, money, land, the full royal starter pack of indulgence. And with those gifts came whispers that sounded eerily familiar. The king loves him too much. Then came George Villiers, the last and greatest of the royal favorites. Villiers was no fool. He studied what Carr had done wrong and improved on it. He was careful, graceful, and calculatedly affectionate. James adored him. Their letters survive, a treasure trove of coded endearments that balance on the thin line between kingly warmth and romantic confession. I desire only to live in your heart, James wrote. I count all my blessings in your eyes. Villiers replied in kind. Historians have been polite about it for centuries. They call it intimate friendship. They analyze the politics, the patronage, the influence. But you can read the letters yourself. The tenderness doesn't hide. James was a man who loved profoundly, and inconveniently. For a king who ruled two kingdoms, he often seemed to be ruled by his own longing for connection. And yet, his reign endured. He wasn't toppled. He wasn't destroyed by his attachments. In a strange way, his ability to survive scandal says something about how the world was changing. The old medieval slanders, the ones that wrecked Edward II, couldn't bring down a Renaissance monarch who wrote poetry, sponsored Shakespeare, and preached divine right with the same breath he used to whisper affection into Villiers' ear. But there's another irony. For all his talk of divine order and masculine kingship, James's private affections were shaped by vulnerability. The loss of his mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, executed when he was just a boy. The isolation of a child king surrounded by adults who treated him like a tool. His love for men like Esme and Villiers wasn't rebellion. It was repair. A lifelong attempt to fill the void of a stolen childhood. By the time James died in 1625, Villiers was the most powerful man in England, and the monarchy had acquired a strange dual legacy. A king remembered both for his scripture and his scandal. His Bible translation would define English religion for 4 centuries. His letters would define royal intimacy in a way the official historians preferred to skip. But power and affection always leave traces. And if James reigned as a man forever half in love with his favorites, what about the king who came before him? The one called Lionheart, who shared his bed with another king, and left behind a legend carved in equal parts courage and secrecy. Because for Richard the Lionheart, the battlefield wasn't the only place he risked everything. And if you're still with us after that, welcome to the deep end. If unraveling royal secrets and rethinking history is your thing, don't forget to subscribe and join the growing circle of late-night listeners and curious minds. While you're at it, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Are you tuning in from a quiet midnight corner, or streaming this during a rogue lunch break? 3. Richard Forster, the Lionheart. History prefers its heroes loud and uncomplicated, and Richard the Lionheart was exactly that, on paper. He was the warrior king, the crusader, the shining sword of Christendom. He stormed castles, sang ballads, and terrified Saladin. He spent less than a year of his 10-year reign in England, but no matter, his reputation conquered the rest. Statues were raised. Poems were penned. England loved him for what he represented: strength, piety, and the kind of masculine energy that cracked skulls and didn't cry about it. Except, Richard didn't play the part quite as cleanly as the legend suggests. Behind the armor and the lion banner was a man whose emotional life was far murkier than the chronicles let on. The story goes that he was bold and brave, but bravery doesn't cancel out contradiction, and Richard was full of it. He was born in 1157, one of the many sons of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II, a royal pairing known more for their battlefield of a marriage than for peaceful domesticity. Richard grew up in Aquitaine, speaking French better than English, and wielding a sword better than a pen. But he was also a poet, a courtly lover of lyricism and symbolism, a man who used language to blur the lines between reality and romance. And then there's Philip II of France, the rival king, the diplomatic partner, the one-time ally in the Third Crusade, and, according to some chroniclers, something more. Contemporary accounts describe Richard and Philip not just as political allies, but as men who ate from the same dish and slept in the same bed. Now, before modern assumptions rush in, it's worth noting that bed sharing among nobility wasn't always erotic. It could be symbolic of trust or status. But when chroniclers go out of their way to note it, and especially when political enemies weaponize it, the bed starts looking less like a symbol and more like a signal. Even the famously hostile Roger of Hoveden, no fan of Richard, remarked on the unusual intimacy between the two kings. The historian William of Newburgh called the relationship excessive. And in the carefully coded world of medieval chronicling, excessive is rarely a compliment. When Richard married Berengaria of Navarre in 1191, midway through the crusade, Philip reportedly had an emotional reaction that was not diplomatic. The marriage itself was almost theatrical. No known children. Berengaria barely spent time with Richard, and the whole affair seemed like a strategic gesture more than a union of passion. Richard, famously, fathered no legitimate heirs, and the romantic female figures in his life barely leave a historical ripple. But perhaps the loudest silence in Richard's life is the one that followed his return from the Holy Land. Captured in Austria and ransomed for a king's fortune, he returned to England older, more tired, and politically bruised. His later years were spent in France, endlessly defending his territory. The lion still roared, but now with more caution. And then there's the confession. In 1195, under ecclesiastical pressure, Richard performed a public penance. What for? The sources don't specify, but the timing, the surrounding rumors, and the shadow of church doctrine suggest the offense was of a personal nature, something related to behavior rather than policy. Some historians cautiously propose that this could have been a quiet acknowledgement of private acts the church considered sinful. But of course, sin is a matter of who's writing the rules. Modern scholars remain divided. Some argue that Richard's masculinity was so lion-like, the idea of queerness seems incompatible. Others point out that queerness and courage are not mutually exclusive, especially not in an era when kings used intimacy as strategy, and personal loyalty could swing the fate of nations. Whether or not Richard loved Philip in the way we define love today is beside the point. What matters is that something about that relationship haunted the record. Something about their closeness made people nervous. And in a world where male affection could be easily coded as political or perilous or both, it's the ambiguity that lingers. Richard went to war for God, for glory, and maybe for something far more personal. Because if Richard's legend was built on what he did with a sword, the real mystery might be what he left unsaid. And as we follow the crown down to his namesake a few generations later, a boy king beloved by a favorite so intensely it triggered a civil war, we start to see a pattern emerge. A pattern not just of power and favoritism, but of longing disguised as loyalty. 4. Richard II of England. There are kings who inherit a throne, and then there are kings who inherit a script, written by enemies, revised by allies, and footnoted by chroniclers too cautious to say what they meant. Richard II, crowned at just 10 years old, didn't just inherit a kingdom. He inherited a nation waiting for him to fail, and when he did, they wrote his downfall like a cautionary tale. Don't be too soft. Don't love the wrong people. And whatever you do, don't play favorites unless you want your crown taken and your legacy twisted. Richard came of age in a kingdom that still trembled from the Black Death and still bled from the peasants' revolt. Power was fragile, expectations brutal. In this world, a king was supposed to be strong, militaristic, and masculine in the medieval sense of the word, aggressive, pragmatic, emotionally reserved. Richard, by contrast, was poetic, ceremonial, refined, and, worst of all, attentive to beauty in people, art, and politics. He spent more on robes than horses. He poured money into Westminster Abbey, hired painters and poets, and surrounded himself with a carefully curated inner circle of elegant courtiers. It was this circle that would define his reign and his undoing. Enter Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Tall, striking, and just a few years older than the king, de Vere quickly became Richard's closest companion. The two hunted together, traveled together, slept under the same roof, and perhaps, though this remains unprovable, shared something deeper than brotherhood. What is provable is how deeply Richard loved him. He showered de Vere with titles and honors, most controversially naming him Duke of Ireland, a title that infuriated the nobility. It was an unmistakable elevation, one rooted not in war or lineage, but in intimacy. The reaction was swift. The Lords Appellant, a group of powerful nobles, accused de Vere of corrupting the king and manipulating him for personal gain. They launched what amounted to a hostile takeover of the crown's authority, and in 1388, de Vere was forced into exile. Richard, for his part, never forgave them. His political revenge came a decade later, in what historians now call the Tyranny, a period where Richard consolidated power, bypassed Parliament, and punished the men who had humiliated him. But the damage was already done. The image of Richard as a soft, effeminate king, more obsessed with luxury than leadership, had calcified. Chroniclers like Thomas Walsingham painted him as vain, aloof, and overly attached to his male companions. Whispers of unmanliness followed him everywhere. Whether or not Richard and de Vere shared a romantic relationship is ultimately unknowable. But the emotional charge of their bond was enough to shake the nobility and cast a permanent shadow over Richard's reign. This wasn't just about favoritism, it was about gender and the performance of it. Richard's court was accused of being overly theatrical, overly refined, and worst of all, unmilitary. For a medieval king, not riding into battle was practically a confession of weakness. Richard preferred diplomacy. He liked peace. He liked order. But the barons wanted blood and land. Richard offered symbolism. They wanted steel. Eventually, it was his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, later Henry IV, who rose against him. Richard was captured and deposed. Historians still argue over what happened next. Some say he was starved in captivity. Others say he was quietly murdered. Some, naturally, claim he escaped and lived out his days in secret. The crown passed on, but the legend of the failed king remained, a monarch undone not just by policy, but by perception. Because Richard II didn't just lose his throne, he lost control of his story, a boy king who loved beauty in a world that demanded brutality, a ruler too delicate for an age that praised hard edges. And if he was mocked for being too much like a poet, then the next man on our list would be judged for being too much like a foreign prince, elegant, reserved, and far too fond of a man named Bentinck. 5. William III of England. If history is a mirror, then William III of England was always careful not to look too long. There was something almost ghost-like about him, a figure who drifted in from the Low Countries, cold as fog and twice as silent, ruling not with charisma but with calculation. To many of his English subjects, William felt like a necessary inconvenience. A Protestant prince, conveniently married to Mary, daughter of the Catholic-leaning James II, and conveniently ready to invade when Parliament decided the old king had gone too far. But William didn't seize the throne with a roar. He walked in through a vacuum. England didn't rise to greet him with flowers. It shrugged. It accepted. And William in turn accepted England. Coldly. Efficiently. As if he were inheriting a problem, not a kingdom. He was never much interested in spectacle. His coronation was perfunctory. His speeches were sparse. His smile was rare and unreassuring. But those who watched closely noticed something peculiar about the way he ruled, something precise in his loyalties, intense in his preferences. William didn't keep a wide circle. He kept a fortress, and at the center of it stood a man named Hans Willem Bentinck. Bentinck was no ordinary courtier. He had been by William's side since their youth in the Netherlands, a page turned advisor turned shadow. During William's illnesses, it was Bentinck who slept in the king's chamber. During the invasion of England, it was Bentinck who organized the logistics. And after the Glorious Revolution, it was Bentinck who became Earl of Portland, first gentleman of the bedchamber, and, quietly, the most powerful man not wearing a crown. Their letters survive, though carefully worded and maddeningly ambiguous. In one, William tells Bentinck that no one else has his heart, his trust, his everything. In another, he asks Bentinck why his affection seems to cool, why his loyalty feels less warm. The kind of letter you don't write to a servant. The kind of letter that suggests something deeper than political alliance. And that's when the rumors started. Parliament murmured. The court speculated. Queen Mary, William's wife and co-ruler, watched silently as her husband elevated Bentinck above even her own influence. In public, she played the loyal queen. In private, she likely kept score. Mary died childless in 1694, and William continued alone. Still cold, still formal, still surrounded by men he trusted implicitly and emotionally, in a way that felt, to outsiders, oddly intense. After Bentinck came Arnold Joost van Keppel, a young Dutch nobleman who rose through the ranks with alarming speed. Keppel was decades younger than William, strikingly handsome, and, by all accounts, devoted. The English court reeled. Even friendly courtiers, already accustomed to William's quiet favoritism, were troubled. "It tarnishes His Majesty's reputation," one wrote. Not because Keppel had done anything wrong, but because William had made the attachment so obvious. He gave Keppel land, titles, proximity. The optics were unsubtle. And yet, no proof of impropriety ever surfaced. Historians still debate it. Were these relationships romantic or merely intense friendships formed in the crucible of war and exile? But if we strip away the need to define, we see the pattern. William surrounded himself not with flatterers, but with men who made him feel safe. Men who shared his silences, who understood the burden of ruling from the shadows, who didn't flinch when the English press accused him of being aloof, foreign, or, occasionally, unnatural. And maybe that was the point. William didn't try to charm England. He tried to outlast it. He ruled like a man boarding a ship during a storm, tight-lipped, controlling, unwilling to bend to emotion in public, but deeply dependent on his chosen few in private. And those few happened to be men. By the time he died, his health broken and his court colder than ever, William left behind no heirs and no confessions. Just letters, just patterns, just enough ambiguity to keep historians in business. But if William ruled from the shadows, the next king on our list practically lit them up. A monarch whose court was infamous for its silk, its scandal, and its suspiciously theatrical disregard for the moral expectations of his time. His reign lasted barely 13 years. His nickname was Rufus, and nobody could decide whether he was ruling England or auditioning for it. 6. William II. Rufus' history doesn't like a mystery it can't domesticate, and William II, known to posterity as Rufus, the Red King, is exactly that. Unsolved, unclaimed, and uncomfortably resistant to narrative. He reigned from 1087 to 1100, wedged between the grand ambitions of his father, William the Conqueror, and the saintly reputation of his younger brother Henry I. His reign is usually footnoted with words like troublesome, impious, or unpopular. But these are the labels history uses when it doesn't know what to do with someone. Rufus didn't fit the mold, and so they buried him, literally and metaphorically. Let's start with the optics. William Rufus didn't marry. He didn't have children. He didn't even seem remotely interested in the idea. In an era when kings were expected to secure dynasties, Rufus built none. His court, famously secular and famously flamboyant, was a place of jeweled robes, foreign fashion, and a suspicious absence of queens or princesses. Contemporary chroniclers, men like Orderic Vitalis and Eadmer, didn't miss the opportunity to raise an eyebrow. They described his court as effeminate, filled with men who curled their hair, wore tight garments, and imitated the dress and manners of women. In the medieval mind, this wasn't just a fashion critique, it was moral condemnation. The more brightly the king's court shone, the more it threatened the dark simplicity of ecclesiastical control. And the church hated it. Archbishop Anselm, later sainted, clashed repeatedly with Rufus over clerical appointments, church property, and spiritual authority. But under the surface, these weren't just arguments about governance. They were arguments about masculinity, about power, and about performance. To the monks, William's reign looked like a stage play, all glitter and no God. To the barons, it looked like a king dangerously indifferent to convention. And to modern readers, it looks like a man who may have been quietly, deliberately subverting the expectations of kingship. Because it wasn't just that Rufus wasn't married, it was that he didn't seem to care that people noticed. There's no direct evidence of lovers, male or female, but absence, in this case, doesn't imply innocence. It implies a deliberate blank space. William's emotional life is a void, and that void speaks loudly. Chroniclers accused him of sodomy, a word that in medieval parlance meant anything from actual sexual acts to general moral deviance. But unlike later kings whose relationships were wrapped in rumors and letters, Rufus left behind almost no personal correspondence. No pleas, no poetry, no explanations. He simply reigned. And then, one day, he didn't. The end came in 1100, with an arrow through the chest while hunting in the New Forest. The official account calls it a tragic accident. The unofficial theories, of which there are many, suggest otherwise. Some say it was an assassination, plotted by his brother Henry, who wasted no time claiming the crown. Others think it was divine punishment, a cosmic arrow fired at a king too blasphemous to live. But what matters is not how he died, but how quickly the world forgot to mourn him. William Rufus was buried without ceremony in Winchester Cathedral. No grand tomb, no poetic epitaph, no dynastic grief, just a silence that said more than any sermon. And maybe that was fitting. Rufus didn't fit into any of the stories the medieval world wanted to tell, so they stopped telling stories about him altogether. But the silences still hum. A king without a queen, a court without convention, a reign without heirs, and just like that, a red king fades into shadow. Yet shadows have echoes, and centuries later, another royal would emerge, this one in the prim, polished world of the 20th century, who also refused to fit the mold. He wore medals, took lovers, and crashed into myth with the same quiet defiance. His name was George, and unlike Rufus, we actually have the photos. 7. Prince George, Duke of Kent. If most British royals are expected to move through life like porcelain, ornamental, fragile, and politely opaque, then Prince George, Duke of Kent, was more like stained glass, elegant, colorful, and impossible not to stare at when the light hit just right. Born in 1902, the fourth son of George V and Queen Mary, he entered the world already eclipsed by a line of older brothers with more obvious futures. But George was never meant to be ordinary. He didn't behave like he was auditioning for king. He behaved like someone performing something far less traditional and far more intriguing. The history books usually don't know what to do with him. He wasn't just a royal, he was a naval officer, a style icon, a man with a film star's profile and a reputation that flickered between aristocratic scandal and whispered legend. While his siblings gave speeches and raised families, George seemed to orbit a different sun entirely, and that orbit included people like Noel Coward and Cecil Beaton, and possibly, according to several biographies, men whose names never made it into official records. George's life was a study in contradiction. Buttoned-up uniforms and open secrets, impeccable grooming and unchecked rumors. He was the first Windsor to publicly be rumored as bisexual, though the word itself wouldn't have been used at the time. Back then, such talk came wrapped in euphemism, bohemian tastes, artistic temperaments, cosmopolitan circles. But everyone knew what those phrases meant. He moved through London's social elite like a shadow, always present, never still. The press adored his style but carefully dodged his private life. Those who knew him spoke of a man both magnetic and melancholy, brilliant and self-destructive. His relationships with women were public, well-documented, and sometimes performative. His relationships with men, well, that's where the fog rolls in. Modern biographers suggest affairs with playwrights, diplomats, and even a fleeting entanglement with the famous American spy Anthony Blunt, though evidence remains speculative and controversial. Still, enough threads remain to form a pattern. George wasn't hiding. He just wasn't explaining. In a world where royals were meant to embody tradition, he embodied discretion. And then there's the matter of his death. In 1942, during World War II, George's military plane crashed in northern Scotland under circumstances that have never been entirely explained. Conspiracy theorists have had a field day ever since. Was he on a secret mission? Was the crash sabotage? Was someone else on the plane who wasn't meant to be there? The official version names it a tragic accident. But unofficially, theories persist that George's personal life may have played into his sudden early death, if not causally, then contextually. Because George didn't die as a fully understood man. He died as a royal enigma, handsome, glamorous, and just out of reach. And in many ways, that's the legacy he left behind. A man who lived between lines, who refused to settle into any single version of himself, and who remains, decades later, a symbol of all the things British royalty isn't supposed to be. And yet, he wasn't an exception. He was part of a pattern. Because just a few decades later, another royal would follow a similar path, quietly, carefully, and this time, openly. A cousin to the current king, a father, a lord, and in 2018, a groom. 8. Lord Ivar Mountbatten. Royal bloodlines are usually more obsessed with the past than the present. But Lord Ivar Mountbatten, great-great-great-grandson of Queen Victoria, cousin to both the late Prince Philip and King Charles III, stepped directly into history not by honoring tradition, but by quietly rewriting it. In 2018, he became the first member of the extended British royal family to have a same-sex wedding. No scandal, no public protest. Just a countryside ceremony, a few family members, and the sound of several centuries of silence, finally breaking. It's tempting to treat Ivar's story as a modern anomaly, the first time a royal, however distant from the throne, had the courage to live openly as gay. But that framing misses the point. Ivar's life doesn't disrupt the royal tradition. It simply sheds light on what's always been there. The quiet presence of queerness behind palace gates, no less real for being unspoken. Born in 1963, Lord Ivar was raised in the cool, well-upholstered corridors of aristocracy. Educated at Gordonstoun, the famously rigorous boarding school that also molded his cousin Charles, he followed a script that had been rehearsed for generations. Marry well, raise children, uphold appearances. And for a time, he did just that. He married Penelope Thompson in 1994. Together they had 3 daughters. Their marriage lasted 17 years before ending in a quiet, amicable divorce in 2011. Then came the sentence that would change everything, tucked into an interview in 2016. I am gay. No dramatics, no grand announcement, just an acknowledgement. The kind that had eluded royal men for centuries, even when everyone already knew. Ivar didn't come out with a megaphone. He came out with a shrug, a smile, a sense that, perhaps for the first time in his life, he wasn't performing. The public response was strikingly muted. No royal outrage, no tabloid frenzy. And maybe that's the real shift. Ivar wasn't punished. He was embraced. His daughters supported him. His ex-wife walked him down the aisle at his wedding to James Coyle. The ceremony, held at their family estate of Bridwell Park, was small, understated, and radically ordinary. For a family that has spent centuries perfecting the art of controlled image, Ivar's wedding felt quietly revolutionary. No coat of arms, no sweeping declarations, just a man marrying another man under the Devon sky. But the significance didn't end there. Ivar's openness wasn't just personal, it was generational. It suggested a crack in the foundation, one wide enough for light to get in. If a descendant of Queen Victoria could marry his male partner and remain a welcome figure at royal gatherings, what did that say about the stories the monarchy had spent so long avoiding? Still, Ivar never made himself a symbol. He never tried to be a spokesperson for queer identity. His life, like his demeanor, remained characteristically English, understated, a bit reserved, and steeped in quiet rebellion. He didn't storm out of the closet. He opened the door, stepped through, and offered everyone else a cup of tea. But even in this most modern of royal stories, the past lingers. Because for every Ivar, there were dozens of others, men born centuries earlier, bound by duty, shadowed by expectation, and unable to speak their truth. Some left behind coded letters, others only rumors. And one of them, born nearly 500 years before Ivar, stood beside Mary, Queen of Scots, shining like a peacock in a world of hawks. His name was Henry. His friends called him beautiful. His enemies called him dangerous. 9. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley. When Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, arrived at the Scottish court in 1565, he did not come quietly. He came shimmering. Draped in silks, tall and golden-haired, with a pedigree that made him both English and Scottish royalty, he looked like a prince from the pages of a romance, if the romance had been written by someone with a flair for disaster. He was elegant, ambitious, and fatally charismatic. Mary, Queen of Scots, fell for him almost instantly. But whether he ever truly belonged to her, or to anyone, is a question that still drifts unanswered through the centuries. Darnley married Mary that same year, a union that pleased no one but themselves. The English crown saw it as a threat, the Scottish nobles saw it as an insult, and even Mary's closest advisers worried that Darnley was more preening peacock than proper consort. He wanted power, status, and adoration. But what he gave in return was instability. Within months, he'd burn through goodwill like candle wax, alienating courtiers, offending his wife, and positioning himself less as a king and more as a mirror, all surface, no depth. But the real mystery of Lord Darnley isn't just his political incompetence, it's his emotional center, or the lack of one. While his marriage to Mary was, at first, one of intense passion, it curdled with extraordinary speed. His neglect of her during her pregnancy, his erratic behavior, and his obsessive jealousy made their union more theatrical than functional. And at the center of that storm stood one man, David Rizzio, Mary's private secretary. Rizzio was an Italian musician who had climbed the court ladder with unusual speed, eventually becoming Mary's closest confidant. But it was his closeness to Darnley that triggered whispers. Some observers noted the way Darnley lingered in Rizzio's company. Others recorded the unmanly affection he showed. The trio, Mary, Rizzio, and Darnley, became the court's unspoken triangle, their dynamic full of elegance, envy, and ambiguous loyalties. In 1566, Rizzio was brutally murdered, dragged from Mary's chambers by armed men and stabbed dozens of times in front of the pregnant queen. Darnley was among the conspirators, or at least complicit. His motivation was framed as jealousy, of Rizzio's influence, of Mary's affection, and perhaps, just perhaps, of something even more personal. The records are cautious. They don't name the desire outright, but the shape of it is there, like an outline left in dust. After Rizzio's death, Darnley became increasingly isolated, both politically and emotionally. His behavior grew erratic. He made enemies faster than allies. And in 1567, less than 2 years after marrying Mary, he was found dead, blown up in an explosion, then discovered in a garden nearby with no apparent wounds. The contradictions surrounding his death have never been resolved. Assassination? Revenge? A staged accident? Theories abound, but the facts remain elusive. So does the man himself. Darnley remains to this day a royal riddle, a consort who never quite fit into his role, a husband who could not love without destroying, a prince who may have loved men more easily than he loved power. His story is one of glittering surfaces and hollow centers, of a life lived in mirrors and performances. And it's not unique. Across the channel, in another royal court built on ceremony and scandal, another man rose and fell under the weight of whispered intimacy. His name was Ernest, and his downfall, unlike Darnley's, came not with an explosion, but with the soft click of a locked door, and the silence that followed. 11. Henry Benedict Stuart, Cardinal Duke of York. In the long twilight of the Jacobite cause, when the royal dream had faded into mist and exile, there remained one final flickering light. Henry Benedict Stuart, the man who would have been king, if fate had been kinder or history more forgiving. Born in 1725, the younger brother of Charles Edward Stuart, bonny Prince Charlie to balladeers and romantics, Henry lived not in palaces, but in the echo of them. And while his brother fought battles, stirred rebellions, and drank away his legacy, Henry took a different path altogether. He gave himself to the church, or at least, that's what the records say. By all official accounts, Henry's life was one of piety. Raised in Rome, the exiled prince turned his back on the throne he would never inherit, and instead embraced the robes of a cardinal. Appointed at the improbably young age of 22, he rose quickly within the Catholic hierarchy. To the Vatican, he was a Stuart. To Rome, he was royalty in exile. To the British crown, he was a quiet embarrassment. A living reminder that not everyone had agreed with the whole Hanoverian succession thing. But what makes Henry's story unusual isn't just that he became a cardinal, it's that he never stopped being a prince. He styled himself Henry IX, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, at least in private. The Jacobites, those ever-faithful historians of lost causes, referred to him as such long after the idea of a Stuart restoration had drifted into fantasy. And through it all, Henry remained celibate, unmarried, childless, alone. On paper, of course, this was expected. Cardinals are celibate by rule, by design. The Catholic Church demanded chastity, and Henry, to all appearances, gave it. But not all silence is pious, and not all devotion is holy. The deeper one looks into Henry's life, the more one begins to notice peculiarities. He maintained close, emotionally intense friendships with a small circle of men, fellow clergy, assistants, protégés, relationships that sparked quiet speculation but never public scandal. Letters survive, though most are written in the courtly and careful language of the 18th century aristocracy. They speak of loyalty, affection, even dependence. Nothing scandalous, nothing explicit, just closeness. The kind that raises eyebrows centuries later, when read through the lens of modern sensibilities. But speculation is dangerous when history has been scrubbed clean. Henry left behind no confessions, no dramatic correspondence, no locked diaries full of truths. What he did leave was a life of extreme emotional discipline. A life spent watching everyone he loved die or disappear. His brother, his cause, his crown. And through it all, he remained loyal. To his church, to his name, to something deeper than politics or theology. Perhaps to a version of himself that was never allowed to be seen. In his final years, Henry lived in quiet poverty. His titles hollow, his influence faded. Napoleon stripped him of his income. The British government, in a strange twist of historical irony, gave him a pension. He died in 1807, the last legitimate male Stuart, buried in the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica, his tomb inscribed with the royal titles England never recognized. And yet, perhaps the most remarkable thing about Henry Benedict Stuart is how deliberately he chose invisibility. No scandals, no heirs, no narrative to reclaim, just a life meticulously arranged to avoid scrutiny and perhaps to protect something sacred. But if Henry's silence was strategic, the next prince's was accidental. Because when Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, second in line to the throne, found himself tangled in one of the most scandalous rumors of his age, he didn't defend himself. He didn't need to. History would do the erasing for him. Or so they thought. 12. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence, Eddie. In the vast mahogany-paneled corridors of Victorian monarchy, Prince Albert Victor, known to his family and to scandal as Eddie, moves like a shadow dressed in royal blue. The eldest son of Edward VII and the grandson of Queen Victoria, Eddie was born into a life mapped out by duty, a future king, a model heir, a symbol of continuity for a sprawling empire obsessed with stability. But what the public wanted was a prince with gravitas. What they got was a whisper. Even in his own lifetime, Albert Victor was a mystery wrapped in etiquette and cloaked in vague concern. He was physically striking, tall, blonde, with a classically noble face, but even friends noted his detachment, his dreaminess, his tendency to drift off in conversation. Queen Victoria worried about his intellect. Tutors quietly questioned his comprehension. Biographers, ever charitable, have described him as sensitive, gentle, and unworldly. His uncle Leopold simply called him delicate. Eddie's education was an exercise in denial. He was shuffled through Cambridge, then assigned to the Royal Navy, and eventually placed in a ceremonial role in the Army, none of it a particularly good fit. Still, none of this made him dangerous. Just disappointing. It wasn't until 1889, when his name was suddenly and mysteriously linked to a scandal at Cleveland Street, that the quiet prince became the center of a royal firestorm. The Cleveland Street scandal was, on the surface, about a male brothel in London and the telegraph boys who worked there. It was a slow-burning revelation, beginning with the arrest of a postal worker and ending in high places no one dared name aloud. Several aristocrats fled the country. A handful of names were hushed, and somewhere, in the swirling fog of rumor, Albert Victor's name appeared, once, then twice, then persistently enough to leave a permanent mark. There was never any concrete evidence tying Eddie to the brothel. His name was not in the ledgers. No testimony directly implicated him. And yet the gossip spread with remarkable precision. Some claimed he was a frequent visitor. Others said he had been protected by the government. Still others insisted it was a deliberate smear campaign to remove him from the line of succession. The palace went quiet. No denial, no lawsuit, no visible damage control, just a sudden, collective silence. Eddie was hastily sent abroad. The scandal faded, never quite erased, but effectively shelved. He was later engaged to Princess Mary of Teck in what can only be described as a marriage of optics, not affection. They never wed. Instead, Eddie died in 1892, suddenly, at age 28, of influenza and pneumonia during an epidemic. His death was swift and deeply mourned. Queen Victoria was devastated. The nation wept for its lost prince, and the future changed course. The throne passed instead to his younger brother, George V, ushering in a line of kings who, while no less complicated, were at least less whispered about. Yet the legend of Albert Victor never really died. Decades after his passing, he was falsely linked to the Jack the Ripper murders in a sensationalist theory now thoroughly debunked. His image, so carefully curated in life, became a canvas for public anxieties in death. He was the forgotten heir, the maybe queer prince, the scandal that nearly surfaced but didn't. Was Albert Victor gay, bisexual, innocent, framed, protected? It's impossible to say. What's certain is that his life, and the swirl of rumors around it, reveals more about the structures of silence than about the prince himself. A man groomed to inherit the empire, raised to smile, salute, and stay quiet, and who, in the end, was remembered more for what he might have been than for what he was. And then there was Charles I, a king far more certain in his position, but no less enigmatic in his affections. Because while the world remembers his marriage, his trial, and his beheading, it often skips over his earliest and most controversial devotion, a friendship that began under his father's watch, and never quite loosened its grip. 13. Charles verse. Charles Warren is remembered, when he's remembered at all, as the king who talked himself into a beheading, a martyr to some, a tyrant to others, and to most of history, a man who couldn't read a room, much less rule one. But long before the trial, before the executioner's axe and the solemn portraiture, there was another Charles. A young, quiet, painfully shy prince. A second son who was never meant to wear a crown. And like so many royal second sons, he spent his early years trying to impress a father who was already obsessed with someone else. That someone else was George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, a man whose influence over Charles's father, James VI and I, was as personal as it was political. George was dazzling. He had the charm, the cheekbones, and the confidence to walk into a court full of schemers and make everyone else look like they were in rehearsal. He became James's favorite, his confidant, and, according to many historians, possibly his lover. But when James died in 1625, the nature of George's influence didn't die with him. Instead, it passed, somewhat unnaturally, on to his son. Charles's relationship with Buckingham has long puzzled historians. It was intense, affectionate, and immediate. In a monarchy built on rank and ritual, the speed at which George transitioned from his father's companion to the new king's closest advisor was, to say the least, unorthodox. Charles was supposed to be different from James, more serious, more reserved, more traditional. But here was Buckingham again, elevated to dizzying heights of power, this time as Charles's right hand. And once again, the court whispered. To Charles, Buckingham was more than a friend. He was the embodiment of loyalty, glamour, and continuity. They traveled together, governed together, even quarreled like an old married couple. Charles knighted George's relatives, tolerated his failures, and defended him in Parliament with an almost reckless fervor. When Buckingham botched military campaigns and lost favor with nearly every faction in the kingdom, Charles stood by him with a loyalty that bordered on obsession. Critics accused Buckingham of manipulating the king. Charles accused them of treason. The question of whether their relationship was romantic in nature remains unanswered, and likely unanswerable. Charles's letters to Buckingham aren't as openly effusive as his father's, but their partnership was visibly emotional. Charles was not known for warmth. He was a reserved, awkward man, deeply committed to dignity. And yet, with George, there was an ease, a deference, even a kind of emotional dependence. Then came 1628. Buckingham was assassinated by a disgruntled soldier, stabbed in the chest in Portsmouth, where he was preparing for another ill-fated expedition. The news shattered Charles. Witnesses described him locking himself in his chambers, refusing to eat, grieving not just the loss of a friend but the collapse of something far more personal. For a man who seldom expressed his feelings publicly, Charles's reaction was seismic. After Buckingham's death, Charles changed. He became more withdrawn, more paranoid, more convinced of his divine right to rule without interference. He dissolved Parliament. He ruled alone. He made choices no one could explain, except perhaps as the choices of a man who had lost the only person he ever truly trusted. And eventually, those choices caught up with him. In 1649, Charles became the first English king to be tried and executed by his own people. His final words were about God, not George. His legacy became a battleground for ideologues. And Buckingham? He faded into the margins, remembered as a courtier, a schemer, a scapegoat. But the intimacy between Charles and Buckingham, though rarely spoken aloud, remains one of the most emotionally charged partnerships in royal history. A king and his companion. A bond that outlived a dynasty, if not a kingdom. And yet, in the very next century, another king would walk the line between fashion and fascination. A man whose mirrored shoes and powdered face became symbols of excess, and whose most famous companion, Beau Brummel, may have been the one person who ever truly understood the art of royal performance. 14. George IV. If monarchy is theater, then George IV was its most committed method actor. The wigs were taller, the waistcoats tighter, the mirrors more plentiful. He lived like his only job was to be looked at. And for most of his life, that was exactly what he wanted. But beneath the silk, the satire, and the stiff choreography of the Regency court, there was a man deeply at war with the role he'd been handed, and perhaps with the identity he had to perform to keep the spotlight from turning into a searchlight. George IV, then Prince of Wales, entered public life already halfway to parody. Even his own parents thought him unserious. His father, George III, considered him decadent, theatrical, and politically unreliable. But the public was fascinated. He drank excessively, spent extravagantly, and commissioned buildings the nation couldn't afford. He was addicted to fashion, opera, and carefully curated friends. His image became inseparable from Beau Brummel, the dandy who redefined male elegance and, some whispered, understood the prince more intimately than most. Brummel was no ordinary companion. He wasn't a noble, he wasn't wealthy, he didn't even have a title. But for a time, he had something far more valuable: George's attention. Their friendship was magnetic, filled with witty sparring, private dinners, and matching fashion experiments that bordered on performance art. They spent so much time together that people began referring to Brummel as the prince's shadow. In a world that measured masculinity in duels and dispatches, theirs was a partnership made of cravats and coded glances. Brummel's rise was rapid, and so, inevitably, was his fall. As the prince's debts piled up and Brummel's sarcasm grew bolder, the friendship fractured. One night, at a party neither would forget, Brummel referred to the future king as fat within earshot. That was it. The doors of royal favor slammed shut. Brummel fled to France, never to return, and George moved on, to mistresses, decorators, and political handlers. But the echo of their friendship never entirely faded. What made the relationship so ripe for speculation wasn't just the intimacy. It was the way it defied every norm of the time. George, who was supposed to represent royal restraint, surrounded himself with poets, painters, and men who blurred gender lines with deliberate ease. He rejected the stiff masculinity expected of him and embraced an identity that was softer, more aesthetic, and far more performative. His court became a sanctuary for eccentricity, a place where appearances weren't just cultivated, they were worshipped. And yet, George never publicly acknowledged what people whispered. He married Princess Caroline in one of the most disastrous royal unions in British history. They loathed each other almost instantly. He refused to allow her to attend his coronation. Their marriage became a public farce, a legal battle, a royal soap opera. That left the nation divided and amused in equal measure. Privately, George was lonely. His health declined, his debts mounted, the sparkle dimmed. When he finally became king in 1820, he was already more caricature than character, bloated, brooding, and burdened by a life built on illusion. But the man who had once glided through salons with Beau Brummel's laughter in his ear remained, in essence, the same. A monarch who chose beauty over legacy, artifice over honesty, and style over confession. Was he queer? Was he performing? Was he hiding? The truth remains buried beneath satire and scandal. But his story, like so many others in this lineage, reminds us that identity is often negotiated in shadows, especially when the crown demands a mask. And speaking of shadows, our next royal was born into them. A king of Scotland whose 2 marriages ended in silence, whose court chroniclers couldn't quite decide what to call him, and whose masculinity was always measured against what never happened. His name was David II, and his story is defined not by what he did, but by what he didn't leave behind. 15. David II of Scotland. If royal lives are judged by what they leave behind, heirs, battles, treaties, scandals, then David II of Scotland presents an unusually quiet case file. The only surviving son of Robert the Bruce, David inherited not just a kingdom, but a myth. His father was the liberator, the warrior king, the nation builder. David, in contrast, spent much of his reign either in exile, in captivity, or in the shadow of expectations he never quite managed to escape. And yet, despite a reign marked by absence, what David didn't leave behind may say more than what he did. He ruled from 1329 to 1371, ascending the throne at just 5 years old. Almost immediately, the ground beneath him began to shift. The English, still furious about Scottish independence, saw his youth as an opportunity. Edward Balliol, backed by English support, made a play for the Scottish crown. David and his young wife, Joan of the Tower, the daughter of Edward II and Isabella of France, were forced to flee to France, living in Château Gaillard under the protection of Philip VI. Already the script was strange. A child king in exile, married at 7, playing chess while Europe burned. And when David finally returned to Scotland at 17, he did so into a country that had moved on without him. Fractured, wary, and uncertain of the boy who would be king. He ruled with limited success, fought a few battles, and then, at the age of 24, was captured at Neville's Cross by the English. He would spend the next 11 years in captivity, well treated but thoroughly sidelined. It's during these long years of enforced idleness that the historical haze around David thickens. Royal prisoners were expected to conduct diplomacy, maintain decorum, and, ideally, remain celibate. David seemed to take that last part particularly seriously. When he was finally released in 1357, he returned to Scotland to find both his marriage and his court in ruins. His queen, Joan, had remained distant throughout their union, politically and personally. They had no children, no known mistresses, no scandals, no stories. Eventually, they separated. Joan returned to England, where she died in 1362, reportedly still untouched by marital affection. David remarried 2 years later, this time to Margaret Drummond, a noblewoman whose position was politically convenient, but again, no children came. The marriage didn't last. He had it annulled 5 years later. No heirs, no dynastic legacy, just a man, alone again, now approaching the end of his reign. Contemporaries began to whisper. They called him effeminate. They questioned his masculinity, not with direct accusations, but with rhetorical absence. Medieval chroniclers had a language for kings who failed to reproduce. It wasn't always overt, but it was consistent. Unmanly, weak, too pious, more interested in his male companions. None of it proves anything. But in a time when the royal body was expected to perform publicly, David's refusal, or inability to do so, raised more eyebrows than his political missteps ever did. Modern historians remain divided. Some see in David a victim of circumstance, a man pushed from crisis to crisis, never able to assert himself. Others suggest his lifelong avoidance of reproduction and his emotionally guarded nature may have concealed a personal truth. Was he asexual, queer, traumatized, cautious, devoted to privacy in a world that made privacy a luxury kings couldn't afford? Whatever the reason, David II left the Scottish throne without an heir and without fanfare. He died in 1371, his body buried, his legacy already half forgotten. His nephew Robert II, founder of the House of Stuart, succeeded him and restarted the dynastic clock. But David's quiet reign, unmarred by romantic scandal yet colored by pointed speculation, remains a curious anomaly. A king without a queen in practice, a husband without children, a monarch who ruled more like a placeholder than a patriarch. And then, centuries later, came another royal wrapped in silence. A man known more for what he didn't do with his wife than anything he did on the battlefield. They called him saintly, chaste, almost angelic, but some wondered whether that holiness was just another name for absence. His name was Edward the Confessor, and his marriage may have been the most politically polite Cold War in British royal history. 16. Edward the Confessor. In the rigid annals of English history, Edward the Confessor stands apart, not as a conqueror, not as a warrior, and certainly not as a father of kings. He was, by medieval standards, unsettlingly quiet. A king who seemed more interested in prayer than power, more comfortable in his chapel than his court. Crowned in 1042, Edward reigned until 1066, presiding over a kingdom he seemed almost reluctant to rule. His legacy is marked not by what he built or won, but by what he abstained from. And at the center of that abstention is a royal marriage that produced no heirs, raised centuries of speculation, and still today floats uneasily between piety and peculiarity. His wife was Edith of Wessex, daughter of the powerful Earl Godwin, one of the most formidable men in England. Their union was not romantic, it was political. A calculated effort to stitch together two spheres of influence, the royal court and the Godwin dynasty. Edith was no passive bride. She was educated, politically savvy, and well-connected. But her marriage to Edward was more ceremonial than conjugal. No children, no romantic letters, no scandals, just silence. And from that silence grew a legend. Monks and clerics, desperate to paint Edward in the most saintly hue possible, began to suggest that the marriage had never been consummated. They described him as celibate, chaste, angelic, more a monk in a crown than a man on a throne. Later, the church would canonize him, praising his piety and holding up his alleged virginity as proof of his holiness. To them, Edward's lack of heirs wasn't a problem. It was a virtue, a sign of divine restraint, a model of heavenly kingship. But holiness, like history, is rarely unambiguous. Because what medieval hagiographers celebrated, modern historians find deeply suspicious. Celibacy, especially in a royal marriage, wasn't just unusual, it was destabilizing. Kings were expected to produce heirs, to secure dynasties, to perform masculinity through lineage. Edward did none of that. He ruled for over 2 decades and left no legitimate successor. And in the power vacuum that followed, Harold Godwinson, William of Normandy, and a blood-drenched century of invasion rushed in to fill the gap. So why didn't Edward have children? Was it a medical issue? A vow of chastity? A quiet rebellion against a political marriage he never wanted? Or something more personal? Something never written down, but felt between the lines of those monkish accounts? There are theories, of course. Some suggest he made a religious vow of celibacy in gratitude for reclaiming the throne, an oath perhaps never intended to be permanent. Others argue that the church simply manufactured the idea after his death as a kind of PR campaign for sainthood. After all, what's holier than a king who refuses the temptations of the flesh? And yet, there's another possibility, one rarely stated outright but often implied, that Edward may not have been interested in women at all, not in marriage, not in the bedroom, not in the way kings were expected to be. His closest companions were male. His emotional energy seemed to flow toward his faith, his male household, and his personal chaplains. While there's no definitive evidence of romantic or sexual relationships, the total absence of conventional marital behavior is notable. In a time when kings' mistresses were often documented more vividly than their wives, Edward left behind no such trail. Perhaps he was asexual, perhaps he was queer, perhaps he simply preferred the solitude of his religion to the obligations of reproduction. Whatever the case, Edward the Confessor remains a ghostly figure, saint to some, cipher to others, and a reminder that royal legacy can be shaped as much by absence as by action. But even Edward's carefully cultivated stillness couldn't escape the weaponization of rumor. Because just a few generations later, the mere accusation of effeminacy or unmanliness would be enough to brand a prince as dangerous, even if he'd never done a thing. And that's where our next figure comes in. Not a king, but a symbol. A placeholder for all the medieval fears about power, masculinity, and what happens when rulers start to look a little too soft. 17. Richard, 3rd Duke of York's son, the smear template. There's something uniquely medieval about a smear campaign. Long before tabloids and televised scandals, Royal reputations were broken not by facts, but by formulas. And if there was one accusation guaranteed to bring a prince to his knees, it was this: he's soft. He's effeminate. He's unnaturally close to his male companions. He prefers their company. He can't rule. He isn't man enough. The target didn't really matter. It could be a king, a duke, or a rival claimant to the throne. The accusation worked like a poisoned pen letter, vague enough to avoid proof, sharp enough to cause permanent damage. And if you're looking for a case study in this particular royal pathology, look no further than the anonymous son of Richard III, Duke of York. Or more accurately, the phantom space in history where all the worst royal rumors were recycled, especially when it came to the boys who dared to seem different. Now, the son in question could be any one of several of Richard of York's children, Edward IV, Edmund, or most iconically, Richard III. But for our purposes, this isn't about identifying a specific figure. It's about the pattern itself, the playbook of slander used against any royal man who didn't walk, talk, or wage war like the medieval ideal of masculinity. The routine was simple. If a prince was unpopular, politically inconvenient, or a bit too polished, the accusations would begin. He was given to unmanly habits. He was overfond of his favorites. He dressed too finely. He had unnatural inclinations. It didn't matter whether the charges were true, only that they stuck. In an age where personal identity was defined almost entirely through performance, deviating from the expected script was more dangerous than treason. This slander tactic was most famously deployed against Edward II and Richard II, whose names became synonymous, unfairly, with effeminacy and implied queerness. But the trickle-down effect extended through the Plantagenet line. Any prince who failed to embody the military masculinity ideal was automatically suspect. And the most insidious part? These accusations rarely included evidence. They didn't need it. The insult was the evidence. Take Richard III, for instance, a king whose body was literally dug out of a parking lot centuries after his death, but whose character was buried under propaganda long before that. Although he's not directly included in our core list, his treatment by Tudor historians illustrates how easily gendered insult became political weapon. He was described as deformed, sly, and emotionally cold, never overtly accused of queerness, but certainly othered. And when unnaturalness was the charge, the insinuation hung in the air like smoke. You didn't need fire, you just needed the smell. This smear template also appeared in countless anonymous pamphlets and plays. In many of them, the so-called unfit prince was painted as more interested in dressing well than governing well. His court was filled with male favorites, his nights filled with whispers. He was coded, not just as weak, but as morally deviant. The suggestion wasn't just that he couldn't rule. It was that his very nature disqualified him from doing so. And yet, the irony couldn't be sharper, because some of the most successful, long-reigning monarchs in British history were the very ones whispered about in these terms. And some of the most aggressively masculine kings, swaggering, violent, loud, brought nothing but instability and bloodshed. The smear said more about the accusers than the accused. This segment, then, isn't about a single person. It's about how queer-coded slander became institutionalized in royal discourse. A pattern so predictable it was practically policy. And it worked. But what happens when a king lives so far outside that mold, so loudly, so brazenly, so famously heterosexual, that even he can't escape the rumors? Enter James IV of Scotland, a monarch whose love affairs were legendary. And yet, somehow, still not enough to silence the questions. 18. James IV of Scotland. For a man whose reputation was built on swagger, steel, and the fluttering sleeves of half the noblewomen in Scotland, James IV was not the kind of king you'd expect to find in a conversation about gender ambiguity. By all traditional accounts, he was emphatically heterosexual, enthusiastically, even performatively so. His list of mistresses is long. his acknowledged illegitimate children even longer, and his political alliances were often forged in bedsheets as much as in battlefields. He was fluent in several languages, obsessed with chivalry, fond of tournaments, and by most measures, the last Scottish monarch to inspire something close to national affection before the crown passed into English hands. And yet, despite the textbook masculinity, the occasional murmur still clings to his name. Whispers of favorites, of close male friendships, of the peculiar flexibility that always seems to attach itself to monarchs who were too complicated to fit neatly into their own myth. These whispers don't dominate his legacy, but they've lingered, stubbornly, on the edge of scholarly footnotes and late-night academic conversations. Let's be clear, the mainstream historical record doesn't contain strong evidence of same-sex relationships in James's life. No love letters, no scandals, no anxious commentary from the church, which, if nothing else, was always first to cry sin. James was, by all observable standards, the opposite of his celibate namesake, James VI N.I., whose letters to male favorites leave little to the imagination. James IV, in contrast, moved through the world with the confidence of a man who believed he didn't need to hide anything. And yet, there's always a yet. Because for all his romantic entanglements with women, there remains something slightly off-script about James. He kept a famously diverse court, filled with scholars, alchemists, and astrologers. He dressed flamboyantly, favoring rich silks and gold-threaded garments that occasionally raised eyebrows among English observers, who viewed his style as Frenchified, which in Tudor subtext was just a polite way of saying, a bit too elegant. He championed poets, musicians, and artisans, and he took an almost theatrical approach to kingship, turning his reign into a performance of idealized Renaissance masculinity. This wasn't effeminacy, but it was performance. And when masculinity becomes a performance, it always leaves room for subversion, for reinterpretation, for projection. His relationships with male courtiers were, on the surface, proper. But a few chroniclers noted how emotionally expressive James could be in private, how much he relied on the counsel of men like William Elphinstone and David Lindsay. Again, there's no evidence of anything improper. But in the context of the time, emotional intimacy between men, especially when accompanied by patronage and favoritism, was always suspect, particularly when it complicated the clean image of virile kingship. Perhaps the speculation isn't about who James was, but who people needed him to be. He lived at a cultural crossroads where medieval expectations collided with Renaissance individuality. He could be a warrior and a poet, a womanizer and a philosopher, a king who confessed his sins with genuine remorse, but who also demanded complete control over the image of his reign. And in that space, in the blurred line between authenticity and performance, comes the flicker of possibility, not evidence, but atmosphere. James died in 1513 at the Battle of Flodden, the last British monarch to fall in battle. His body was never definitively recovered. His death, like parts of his life, remains elusive. The king who had seemed larger than life vanished into legend, leaving behind children, poetry, and a kingdom soon to be swallowed by the ambitions of Henry VIII. But history has a way of looping back. And if James IV's story brushes faintly against the idea of ambiguity, the next figures does so in bold ink and angry pamphlets. He was the younger brother of a king, the infamous signer of Magna Carta's reversal, and a ruler whose enemies didn't just call him a tyrant, they called him unnatural. His name was John, and the rumors weren't kind. 19. John, King of England. If kings are remembered for what they build, then King John is remembered for what fell apart under his watch. He's the villain of Robin Hood, the brother who couldn't quite fill Richard the Lionheart's armor, the monarch who signed the Magna Carta only to immediately regret it. In the grand lineage of English rulers, John tends to show up near the bottom of the rankings, petty, paranoid, and persistently unpopular, and perhaps most interestingly, smeared in ways that reveal more about medieval politics than about his actual behavior. Born in 1166 as the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, John was never meant to be king. His brothers were larger-than-life figures. Henry the Young King, Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey of Brittany. John, by contrast, was the afterthought, nicknamed Lackland because he had no significant inheritance. But history has a way of punishing the survivors. One by one, his brothers died or fell, and by 1199, John inherited the throne. And from the moment he put on the crown, people seemed determined to find reasons to take it off him. He didn't help his own case. John's reign was plagued by failures, military, political, personal. He lost Normandy to the French, levied taxes that made the barons seethe, and sparked rebellions with his erratic rule. But amid all the documented failures, a quieter campaign of character assassination began to emerge. John wasn't just a bad king. He was, according to his enemies, something worse, unnatural. This is where things get murky. Accusations of sodomy appear in chronicles of the time, though always as slurs, never as documented events. The word in medieval Europe had a fluid, expansive meaning, covering everything from non-procreative sex to vaguely defined moral corruption. In John's case, it was likely shorthand for unfitness. Monks, barons, and political opponents needed a way to explain why he was so terrible. And so they reached for the standard insults. He was greedy, he was cruel, and he was perverse. Chroniclers like Matthew Paris and Ralph of Coggeshall delighted in dragging John's name through the theological mud. They accused him of heresy, of consorting with Jews and Muslims, of disrespecting the church. And within that stew of accusations, slander about his sexuality began to take shape. Not because there was evidence, but because that's what you did when you wanted to completely delegitimize a king. A ruler who failed in war could still be feared. But a ruler framed as sexually deviant? He could be discarded. And that's what makes John's case so telling. His marital history, 2 wives, several children, and a steady stream of affairs, makes the accusations of queerness implausible if taken at face value. But the persistence of the slander reveals how gender and sexuality were wielded as political weapons. To call a king unmanly in the 13th century was to call him unfit. It was to say that the realm had become inverted. That order had collapsed, which in John's case, it kind of had. By 1215, facing rebellion from the barons, John was forced to sign the Magna Carta, a document now hailed as the foundation of modern constitutional law. But in his own time, it was more like a royal leash, a list of humiliating concessions from a king no one trusted. He died the next year, reportedly from dysentery, though the chroniclers still managed to make his death sound like divine judgment. No noble mourning, no heroic epilogue, just a slow slide into historical villainy. And yet, John's legacy reminds us that character was often constructed by accusation. When kings failed, their enemies rewrote their desires. They painted them not just as incompetent, but as unnatural. Whether it was true didn't matter. What mattered was the stain. And that stain would spread to the next generation. Because John's descendant, Henry VI, would inherit more than the crown, he would inherit a similar arsenal of insults. Quiet, pious, unmanly, and, in the eyes of many, entirely unsuited to the savage business of kingship. 20. Henry VI of England. In a lineage littered with schemers, warriors, womanizers, and tyrants, Henry VI stands out for being none of the above. A king who preferred prayer to politics, solitude to statecraft, and confession to conquest, Henry reigned not with an iron fist, but with an open palm. And in a 15th century England hurtling toward civil war, that wasn't just unusual, it was damning. Crowned as a baby after the death of his father, Henry V, the great military hero of Agincourt, Henry VI was England's youngest king, and in many ways, its most tragic. He inherited a sprawling, war-weary kingdom at 9 months old and was expected to live up to a legacy of ironclad masculinity and relentless victory. But from the beginning, Henry was different. He was mild, soft-spoken, deeply devout, and unlike his father, he had no interest in glory. He was also, perhaps, deeply unwell. Even contemporaries recognized that Henry was prone to long, catatonic silences and episodes of apparent mental collapse. In 1453, he fell into a stupor so complete that he couldn't recognize his own newborn son. His recovery was slow, and his behavior, detached, inward, and oddly serene, never quite aligned with what medieval nobles expected from a ruler. By the standards of the day, Henry was unmanly, not because he wore silk or surrounded himself with favorites, but because he failed to perform the kind of aggressive, visible masculinity his barons and his enemies expected. He didn't lead armies, he didn't command parliament, he didn't even assert himself in court disputes. Instead, he funded colleges, supported religious orders, and spent hours in private devotion. The chroniclers didn't know what to do with this. Neither did the nobles. They started reaching for familiar scripts, and soon the whispers began. Henry was too pious, too quiet, too soft. Some said he was more monk than monarch. Others accused him of neglecting his marital duties with Margaret of Anjou, a French princess known for her strong will and even stronger political ambitions. They had only one child, Edward of Westminster, and even that was clouded with speculation. In the brutal world of 15th-century court gossip, a king's disinterest in women could be fatal to his reputation. But again, there was no scandal, no lovers, male or female, no letters, no secret relationships, just a king who existed like a shadow of sovereignty, present but insubstantial. And that absence, in a court obsessed with virility and dominance, was treated like a provocation. The whispers became barbed. If Henry wasn't leading, who was? The implication wasn't just that he was weak, but that he was possibly inverted, unfit not only in power but in nature. It was a soft accusation, unspoken but corrosive. When the Wars of the Roses erupted, Henry's image was already cracked. His wife became the de facto ruler. His enemies portrayed him as ineffectual and emasculated. He lost the crown, then regained it briefly, then lost it again, this time permanently. Henry VI died in 1471, likely murdered in the Tower of London, though the records, as usual, are carefully non-committal. Within a few decades, he was canonized by popular tradition as a saint, not officially by Rome but by the people, who saw in his quiet suffering something divine. But sainthood, even unofficial, is a strange kind of legacy for a king. In truth, Henry's reputation has never fully recovered, not from his failures in war, nor from the lingering sense that he didn't quite fit the mold. His story is a reminder that queerness in history isn't always about romance or desire. Sometimes it's about deviation, about failing to perform the role, about inviting suspicion simply by being different. And that suspicion didn't end with Henry. In fact, it followed the crown straight into the hands of a man whose body was bent by scoliosis, but whose legend was warped even more. Richard III may have died with a sword in his back, but he lived with 1,000 whispers clinging to his name. 21. Richard III. History remembers Richard III by the curve of his spine and the shadow of a crown he wore for only 2 years. He's the hunchback villain of Shakespeare, the usurper, the tyrant, the murderer of princes, at least according to the tutors who followed him. But strip away the propaganda, the portraits, and the playwright's quill, and what's left is a man whose real life was far more ambiguous, especially when it came to his image, not just politically but personally. Born in 1452, Richard was the 11th of 12 children born to Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, and like so many of his siblings, he was raised amid war. The Wars of the Roses were already unraveling England, and by the time Richard was a teenager, death, betrayal, and shifting alliances were part of the royal curriculum. Still, he rose. First as a loyal commander under his brother Edward IV, then as a trusted northern administrator, and finally as king. But the path to the throne was, infamously, not clean. When Edward IV died, Richard was named Lord Protector for his nephew, Edward V, only to seize the crown for himself weeks later. The princes, Edward and his brother Richard, disappeared in the Tower of London shortly thereafter, a mystery that has haunted his reputation ever since. Whether he was responsible is still debated. What's not debated is that the smear campaign that followed was immediate, theatrical, and devastating. The Tudor regime, eager to solidify its claim, commissioned chroniclers, artists, and playwrights to destroy Richard's legacy. They painted him as physically deformed, morally corrupt, sexually suspect, and emotionally unstable. Thomas More, writing under Henry VIII, described him as a spiteful, envious man with a crooked back, shriveled arm, and sinister nature. Shakespeare, ever the dramatist, took this and ran, creating a Richard whose physical disability mirrored his internal villainy. A grotesque distortion that stuck in the public imagination for centuries. But within these character assassinations, a quieter implication began to emerge, one that scholars still puzzle over. Richard wasn't just evil. He was unnatural. He showed little interest in women. His marriage to Anne Neville was widely seen as political, not passionate. They had one child, who died young. There were no mistresses, no bawdy gossip, no flirtatious court. Even in the sex-obsessed gossip networks of medieval nobility, Richard remained oddly untouched. Some Tudor writers insinuated that his lack of traditional appetites reflected deeper perversions, using the coded language of the time: unmanly, cold, secretive. He was described as more comfortable with his male companions than his wife, more invested in strategy than in spectacle. Was this evidence of queerness? Not necessarily, but in a world where masculinity was measured by conquest, both military and romantic, Richard's restraint, his inwardness, and his emotional distance made him suspicious. And it didn't help that as king, Richard surrounded himself with a small, tightly controlled court. He didn't play to the crowd, he didn't host lavish tournaments or chase courtly romance. His reign was short, intense, and isolated. His closest advisors were men, often from the north, loyal to him personally rather than through inherited office. None of this was scandalous, but it added to the aura of difference, of being apart, of being other. When Richard died at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, he was the last Plantagenet king. His body was thrown into a shallow grave, his enemies triumphant. But centuries later, when that body was rediscovered under a Leicester parking lot in 2012, something strange happened. The myth cracked. The skeleton showed signs of scoliosis, yes, but not deformity. No withered arm, no monstrous frame. Just a man, curved but not broken, real, human. In death, Richard became visible again, not as a villain, not as a saint, but as a person. And the whispers that trailed him in life, about his body, his marriage, his private world, suddenly felt like echoes of a very familiar pattern. When kings don't fit the mold attacks. And speaking of molds, our next king shattered his in a way no amount of Tudor gossip could obscure. A Catholic monarch in a Protestant age, James II lived under constant scrutiny. And while his reign is remembered for revolution, some of the most vicious barbs thrown his way were not about religion, but about identity. 22. James II and VII. In the canon of British kings, James II of England and VII of Scotland is often reduced to one dramatic moment: the Glorious Revolution. The peaceful-ish parliamentary-sanctioned coup that sent him packing and swapped out the last Catholic monarch for a Protestant alternative. But long before exile, before flight to France, and before the ink dried on his dethronement, James was already the subject of a different kind of campaign, one less political and more personal. Because for his enemies, it was never enough to call him a bad king. He had to be an unnatural one. Born in 1633, James grew up in the ideological chaos of the English Civil War. His father, Charles I, was executed. His brother, Charles II, spent years in continental exile. And James himself spent his formative youth moving from court to court, absorbing the contradictions of royal life: Catholicism in Protestant lands, Englishness in foreign courts, and power that vanished the moment anyone questioned its divine right. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, James returned a hardened man. Loyal, severe, and with a moral rigidity that would later cost him everything. James's adult life was, in the official record, thoroughly heterosexual. He married twice. He fathered many children. He had a known history of mistresses, including Arabella Churchill, sister to the future Duke of Marlborough, and no shortage of royal scandals. In terms of sexual reputation, James followed the Stuart mold, equal parts debauchery and denial. No one ever accused him of being disinterested in women, quite the opposite. And yet, when his reign turned sour, and it turned very quickly, the whisper campaigns began to change tune. Political pamphlets began recycling a well-worn accusation used against unpopular kings, that James was sodomitical, perverse, effeminate, or unfit. These weren't references to actual relationships. They were part of a coded lexicon of destruction, where sexual slander functioned as political shorthand. The logic was simple: accuse a king of deviance, and you delegitimize his rule. This wasn't new. It was borrowed directly from the smear playbook used against his father and grandfather. Charles I was accused of unmanly dependence on favorites like Buckingham. James I was ridiculed for his emotional letters to young men. The Protestant imagination, especially in post-Reformation England, loved to tie together Catholicism, secrecy, and sexual corruption. By the time James II took the throne in 1685, these motifs were already etched in the cultural stone. All it took was a spark. And the spark came fast. When James began appointing Catholics to high office, bypassing parliamentary checks, and attempting to roll back anti-Catholic laws, the elite panicked. The birth of his Catholic son, James Francis Edward, in 1688, displacing his Protestant daughters from succession, was the final trigger. But the pamphlets didn't just attack his policies. They attacked his manhood, his judgment, his nature. He was called too close to his Jesuit advisors, too indulgent of foreign men, too French in his sensibilities. Rumors, completely unsubstantiated, suggested his court was full of unnatural vices, drawing on centuries-old anxieties that equated male intimacy with treason. No one dared say outright that James was queer, but they didn't need to. The language did the work. It's worth emphasizing that there is no credible historical evidence to suggest James II had relationships with men. His life, as far as the record shows, was shaped by dynastic ambition, religious conviction, and political miscalculation, not by secret romance. But the fact that his enemies reached for the sodomite king trope anyway reveals how deeply embedded those slurs had become in the arsenal of royal critique. James was deposed not because of his private life, but because his public one collided with a Protestant country unwilling to accept a Catholic dynasty. Still, when he fled to France and lived out his exile under the protection of Louis XIV, the rumors followed. And once again, queerness was weaponized not as a descriptor of identity, but as a symbol of failed kingship. James II remains a cautionary figure, not for what he did, but for how quickly even the most conventionally masculine rulers could be framed as deviant the moment they lost power. Which brings us to a less remembered royal, Frederick, Prince of Wales. Never king, never crowned. But in the court's back rooms, his name was a punchline. his tastes, his friends, his powdered charm. All of it added up to something that didn't quite fit. 23. Frederick, Prince of Wales. History often forgets those who die just before the climax. Frederick, Prince of Wales, lived his entire life as the heir apparent, and then died before he could become king. No great war, no revolution, no dazzling legacy. Just a man caught between the shadow of his father, George II, and the future his son, George III, would go on to define. But Frederick's story doesn't fade because it lacks drama. It fades because the drama was too slippery to fit neatly into official records. His politics annoyed the establishment, his personal habits baffled his family, and his image, so carefully styled, left behind a trail of carefully veiled insinuations that still haven't entirely disappeared. Born in 1707 in Hanover, Frederick spent the first 21 years of his life outside of England, separated from his royal parents for much of his youth. By the time he arrived in Britain in 1728, the distance between him and his father, George II, wasn't just geographical, it was personal. Their relationship was famously hostile. George barely tolerated him. Queen Caroline, Frederick's mother, once allegedly said she hoped her son would be damned. A delightful family, really. But Frederick was nothing if not theatrical. He styled himself as a patron of the arts, a man of letters, a forward-thinking voice in a stale, court-bound world. He wore his hair impeccably. His wardrobe leaned toward the flamboyant. His court, set up in deliberate opposition to his father's, was full of poets, musicians, and eccentric gentlemen with refined tastes and suspiciously vague responsibilities. The political press of the time treated him like a fashionable nuisance. But privately, the gossip around Frederick was less about his political posture and more about his personal one. His entourage leaned unusually masculine, and his closest relationships were with men who shared his enthusiasm for music, theater, design, and long, emotionally charged correspondence. Frederick married Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha in 1736 and had 9 children, which, on paper, silences speculation. But court satirists weren't interested in paper. They noted the separate living quarters, the emotional chill between the couple, and the prince's frequent disappearances into the company of male favorites. Rumors swirled in pamphlets and cartoons, not about specific acts, but about a vibe. His father's allies accused him of being affected, delicate, and too much among the players. In the 18th century royal lexicon, that was code enough. There was no Cleveland Street, no Rizzio, no assassination. Just talk. That vague, persistent energy that surrounds certain historical figures. The sense that everyone suspected something, but no one dared write it down plainly. Still, the culture war between Frederick and his father wasn't limited to personal behavior. It was generational. George II represented stiff Hanoverian authority. Frederick performed as a man of feeling, emotional, performative, and prone to metaphorical flourishes. He championed liberty and opposed war. He embraced Enlightenment thinkers and sympathized with critics of the government. His very aesthetic, pastel waistcoats, powdered wigs, a fondness for poetry, was framed as evidence of ideological softness. And ideological softness, in an age obsessed with muscular monarchy, often bled into sexual suspicion. Frederick died suddenly in 1751, likely of a pulmonary embolism, though some described it more poetically. A burst heart. At the time, he was still the Prince of Wales, the crown just out of reach. His son would become George III, steering the monarchy into revolution, madness, and legacy. But Frederick left behind no royal monument, no definitive scandal, just an aura. And sometimes aura is enough. Especially when it shows up again, generations later, in the story of a royal so performative in his masculinity, so decorated in uniform and parade regalia, that no one dared ask why his lifestyle looked just a little too perfect. A man called dandy by some, eccentric by others, and flamboyant by nearly everyone. His name was Prince William Frederick, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh, and he might be the most Regency figure you've never heard of. 24. Prince William Frederick, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh. In the grand theatre of the British monarchy, where the spotlight tends to land on kings, queens, and crisis makers, Prince William Frederick, Duke of Gloucester and Edinburgh, stood just a few feet off stage, elegantly dressed, impeccably poised, and watched, but never quite watched closely enough. He was a cousin to monarchs, a fixture of Regency high society, and the kind of man who seemed to spend his entire life waiting to be summoned, but never quite was. Still, he made an impression, not through war or law, but through presence. And the whispers that followed him were never about politics. They were about presentation. Born in 1776 to Prince William Henry, the Duke of Gloucester and brother of King George III, William Frederick entered the world with proximity to power, but none of the expectations that came with the crown. He was royal enough to attend coronations, but not so royal that he was ever expected to rule. That gave him space. Space to be different, to lean into spectacle, and to build a persona more theatrical than traditionally kingly. And that persona? Immaculate. The Duke of Gloucester was widely considered one of the most flamboyant men of his era. In the fashion-obsessed, hyper-performative culture of the late Georgian and Regency periods, a world defined by cravats, powder, poetry, and veiled judgments, William Frederick stood out. He dressed with the precision of a man who understood that clothes were a language, and his wardrobe spoke in volumes. Embroidered waistcoats, gilded buttons, velvet jackets, lace-trimmed cuffs. The Duke was never underdressed for a moment in his life. Contemporaries called him a dandy, but it wasn't a compliment. In Regency slang, dandy suggested a man who was too interested in beauty, too consumed by refinement, too far from the martial, stoic masculinity expected of royal men. And when those critiques were aimed at a prince, especially one who stayed unmarried well into middle age, they weren't just about taste. They were about identity. William Frederick didn't seem to mind. He cultivated the role. He was a known presence in drawing rooms and salons, often in the company of other refined bachelors and artists. He patronized music, theater, and fashion with a kind of effortless, aristocratic grace. While other royal men defined themselves by dueling, hunting, or governing, Gloucester curated a life of performance. Not performance in the theatrical sense, but in the deeper, more personal sense, the kind that keeps the outside world focused on your costume, not your core. And then there was his marriage. At the ripe age of 40, William Frederick married Princess Mary, his cousin and the daughter of George III. It was, by all accounts, a marriage of political convenience and familial obligation. No children were born. There was no public passion, no scandal, just a late-in-life union that did very little to quiet the speculation. If anything, it made the timing seem even more conspicuous. Why wait so long unless something had to be covered? The gossip never quite solidified into accusation, but the pattern was familiar. A royal man who avoided marriage until pressured. A social circle dominated by well-dressed men. An absence of documented affairs, male or female. A love of the arts, an aversion to war, and a reputation for charm over command. In short, the Regency formula for coded queerness. Not declared, never proven, but heavily implied. Some historians have tried to rehabilitate Gloucester's image by emphasizing his loyalty to the monarchy, his public service, and his role as a quiet supporter of his cousin's reign. Others have leaned into the ambiguity, treating him as an early example of how queerness in royal circles was lived silently, through style and space rather than speech. But most agree on this. William Frederick's life was less about power and more about aesthetic sovereignty, ruling his own image, crafting his own narrative, and ensuring that, if he couldn't be king, he could at least be unforgettable. He died in 1834, having outlived his political usefulness, but not his fashion sense. His funeral was quiet. His legacy, quieter still. But in the fading corridors of Regency memory, his silhouette remains, elegant, ambiguous, and precisely tailored. And fittingly, our final figure lived with just as much ambiguity, but less privilege. A man elevated by empire, rumored in private, and posthumously portrayed in conflicting lights. He was a war hero, a viceroy, a great uncle to a king, and yet, beneath all those titles was a question no one dared answer publicly during his lifetime. Who really was Lord Louis Mountbatten? 25. Louis Mountbatten, 1st Earl. Mountbatten of Burma. If Britain had a mythological archetype for the perfect imperial gentleman, Lord Louis Mountbatten would have been the blueprint. Soldier, sailor, statesman, royal. A man who seemed to glide through the 20th century wearing crisp uniforms and steely smiles, whispering into the ears of kings, queens, presidents, and prime ministers alike. He was the last viceroy of India, a beloved uncle to Prince Philip, a guiding hand to Prince Charles, and the polished public face of a crumbling empire. But polished faces, like polished silver, hide fingerprints, and behind the gleam of Mountbatten's career, the air around him thickened with whispers that never quite went silent. Born in 1900 to Prince Louis of Battenberg and Princess Victoria of Hesse, Mountbatten was royalty by blood and ambition by nature. He was educated at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, where his charm and confidence earned him the nickname Dickie, though his official name remained Louis. From the outset, he was the kind of figure Britain loved to mythologize. Brave, cosmopolitan, connected. He married well, Edwina Ashley, a wealthy heiress and socialite, and together they cultivated a public image of glamorous, globe-trotting sophistication. But the Mountbattens were never a conventional couple. Their marriage was open, emotionally complicated, and at times practically diplomatic. Edwina had multiple high-profile affairs, including a famously intimate relationship with Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister. Mountbatten, in turn, was discreet, too discreet, some might say. Biographers over the years have noted that their relationship worked more like a partnership than a romance, with mutual affection but separate private lives. And it's here, in the space between what's recorded and what's only remembered, that the questions begin. Mountbatten's sexuality has long been the subject of quiet speculation. In several posthumous biographies, most notably by Andrew Lowney and others, allegations have surfaced suggesting that Mountbatten may have been bisexual, or at least engaged in relationships or encounters that challenged the straight, stiff upper lip persona he maintained in public. The sources for these claims vary. Some anonymous interviews, some MI5 files still redacted, some accounts from people in the royal orbit, but the pattern is consistent. There was talk, there were rumors, there were shadows. In 2019, Lowney's biography referenced FBI files from the 1940s that labeled Mountbatten as a homosexual with a perversion for young boys, an ugly, sensational accusation with no confirmed evidence, widely considered politically charged and deeply problematic in its framing. These documents, likely informed by rival intelligence sources and Cold War paranoia, must be treated with caution. Still, they reflect how Mountbatten's personal life was, at the very least, open to multiple interpretations. What is clearer and more carefully documented is Mountbatten's preference for the company of younger men, particularly in his later years. He surrounded himself with aides and protégés, hosted all-male retreats, and maintained friendships that some described as emotionally intense, even paternal. Among these, his mentorship of Prince Charles was perhaps the most visible. Mountbatten acted as a surrogate grandfather and moral compass, urging Charles toward duty, discretion, and control, advice he himself followed to the letter. Was Mountbatten gay, bisexual, repressed? Expressive in private but closeted in public? The archive won't say. And in many ways, that's the most telling part. As with so many royal-adjacent figures, what's left unsaid becomes part of the legacy. The British establishment, particularly in the mid-20th century, had its ways of keeping certain stories quiet, and Mountbatten, ever loyal, ever controlled, never broke the silence himself. He was assassinated in 1979 by the IRA, his boat blown up off the coast of Mullaghmore, Ireland, killing him, his grandson, and 2 others. The act was political, not personal. But in the years that followed, the man himself became a symbol of loss, not just of a person, but of an era. The sun had long since begun setting on the empire he once administered, and now the man who seemed to embody it had disappeared into the sea. His funeral was a state affair, dignified, mournful, immaculately choreographed. And still, in the back corners of obituaries and biographies, that same echo. The sense that we didn't know him. Not really. That behind the medals and the titles was a man who, like so many before him in royal history, lived a life carefully divided into what could be seen and what must never be said. And perhaps that's the common thread in this long, strange procession of royals. Not scandal, not certainty, but ambiguity. The unanswered question, the flicker behind the eyes, the letters never written, or written and destroyed, because the most enduring mysteries aren't about facts. They're about what people felt they couldn't afford to reveal. And in the House of Windsor and beyond, what remains unsaid has always echoed the loudest.